In 1972, New York City broke ground on a subway line that had already been promised for 50 years. By the time the first section opened in 2017, it had become the most expensive subway construction project per mile in the entire world. We're talking about $4.5 billion for less than 2 miles of tunnel and 3 new stations. To put that in perspective, entire subway systems have been built in other countries for less money. The Second Avenue subway wasn't supposed to be this way. The original plans date back to the 1920s, when the city's transit system was already bursting at the seams. The existing lines on the east side of Manhattan were so overcrowded that riders were literally being packed into cars like sardines every single morning. The Lexington Avenue line, which still carries more passengers than any other route in the Western Hemisphere, was already operating beyond its designed capacity. So the city drew up plans for a new line that would run up 2nd Avenue, parallel to the Lexington line, giving the east side some desperately needed relief. They started preliminary work in the 1970s, digging tunnels and preparing stations. Then New York City went broke. The fiscal crisis of 1975 hit the city so hard that it nearly declared bankruptcy. Municipal services were gutted, thousands of city workers were laid off, and infrastructure projects across the board were abandoned overnight. The 2nd Avenue subway was no exception. Construction shut down completely, leaving behind a series of abandoned tunnel segments that you can still see today if you know where to look. The equipment was pulled out, the holes were sealed, and that was it. For decades, the 2nd Avenue subway became a punchline. It was the promise that politicians would make and then immediately break. It was the project that appeared in every transportation plan and then mysteriously lost funding. New Yorkers started joking that they'd see flying cars before they'd see a 2nd Avenue subway. Then, in the early 2000s, the plan came back to life. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority announced they would finally, really build the 2nd Avenue subway. They broke it into phases to make it seem more manageable. Phase 1 would run from 63rd Street to 96th Street, adding just 3 new stations to the system. It was only 1.8 miles long. Construction began in 2007. Almost immediately, the costs started spiraling. The original budget was around $3.8 billion, which was already eye-watering. But as the work progressed, that number kept climbing. Change orders, unexpected conditions, labor costs, delays. The final price tag hit approximately $4.5 billion. Let's break down what that means. For less than 2 miles of tunnel and 3 stations, New York spent $2.5 billion per mile. When you compare that to subway construction anywhere else in the world, the numbers are almost incomprehensible. Cities in Spain build subway lines for around $100 to $150 million per mile. Copenhagen built an entire automated metro system for less. Even other expensive Western cities rarely break $500 million per mile. New York managed to spend 4 or 5 times that amount, and then some. So, what went wrong? The answer isn't one catastrophic decision. It's 1,000 small failures compounded over years of construction. Start with labor costs. New York requires massive union crews for subway construction, far larger than what you'd see on comparable projects in other cities. Multiple workers doing jobs that might be handled by one person elsewhere. Not because anyone's lazy, but because that's how the labor agreements are structured, and those agreements have been locked in for decades. Then there's the contracting process. The MTA splits projects into dozens of separate contracts, each one going to different firms. This means you've got different companies responsible for excavation, tunnel boring, station construction, electrical systems, and on and on. They all need to coordinate, and when they don't, delays happen. Delays cost money. Sometimes they have to redo work because the separate contractors didn't line things up correctly. The regulatory environment adds another layer of expense. Environmental reviews, community input sessions, historical preservation requirements. These aren't bad things in principle, but in New York, they've evolved into processes that can take years and generate mountains of paperwork. Every delay means paying crews to wait around. Every change means redesigning elements that were already finalized. But here's the thing that really sets New York apart: the sheer difficulty of building anything underground in Manhattan. The island is packed with infrastructure. Century-old water mains, electrical conduits, steam pipes, telecommunications cables, subway tunnels from previous eras. Before you can dig anywhere, you have to carefully map and work around all of it. Sometimes, you have to relocate utilities that are in the way. Each of those relocations is its own miniature project, with its own budget and timeline. The construction method didn't help either. New York insisted on building the stations as massive underground caverns, far larger than functionally necessary. The stations on the 2nd Avenue subway have soaring ceilings, extensive mezzanines, and intricate architectural details. They're beautiful, genuinely impressive spaces. They're also phenomenally expensive to excavate and build. Other cities build functional stations that get the job done for a fraction of the cost. Stockholm, Tokyo, Paris, their stations work just as well and cost a fraction of what New York paid per square foot. When Phase 1 finally opened in January 2017, riders packed the new stations to see what 90-plus years of waiting had produced. The stations were gorgeous, no question. Mosaic artwork, spacious platforms, modern amenities. But the 3 new stops barely made a dent in the overcrowding problem they were supposed to solve. The Lexington Avenue line is still packed beyond capacity every rush hour. And Phase 1 was only supposed to be the beginning. The full 2nd Avenue subway plan includes 3 more phases that would extend the line all the way up to 125th Street and down to Lower Manhattan, connecting the Upper East Side, East Harlem, and the Financial District with a brand new line. Those phases haven't been built. They haven't even broken ground. The cost of Phase 1 scared everyone so badly that there's no serious momentum behind continuing the project. Phase 2, which would add just 3 more stations up to 125th Street, is currently estimated at $7.7 billion. That's billion for 3 stops. Some preliminary work has been funded, but actual construction? That's theoretical at this point. Think about what this means. New York spent $4.5 billion to build 10% of a subway line that's been needed for 100 years. At the Phase 1 cost per mile, completing the entire 2nd Avenue subway would cost somewhere north of $20 billion, maybe $30 billion by the time you factor in inflation and additional delays. That's more than most states spend on transportation infrastructure in a decade. The city's taxpayers funded this. The MTA is financed through a combination of fares, tolls, local taxes, and some federal grants. But the bulk of that $4.5 billion came from people who live and work in the New York metro area. They waited a century for 3 subway stops that cost more than sending multiple missions to Mars. Other American cities should be paying attention to this disaster, because New York isn't the only place where transit construction has become absurdly expensive. Boston's projects routinely run over budget. San Francisco's Central Subway came in at similar per-mile costs. Los Angeles is spending billions on rail expansion. The pattern is consistent. American cities have somehow forgotten how to build infrastructure at reasonable prices. Meanwhile, you've got cities in Asia and Europe pumping out miles of new subway tunnels every year, on time and on budget. They're using the same technology, often the same tunnel boring machines, but they're finishing projects in a fraction of the time for a fraction of the cost. Something is broken in how American cities approach these projects, and nobody in a position to fix it seems particularly interested in doing so. The 2nd Avenue subway stands as a monument to that dysfunction, a project so delayed, so over budget, so compromised in its scope that it barely accomplishes its original mission. 3 beautiful, expensive stations that took 90 years to arrive and still left most of the work undone.